Thanks so much for having me, guys. Show of hands, how many people have blended a sour beer this year? Okay. Is that two hands or is that just one? And then has anyone blended like a big strong ale, imperial stout, barley wine? Okay, this year. Okay, great. So this is kind of a lot of the area I'm focusing in. I'm realizing I realized a long time ago is very different than the production needs of how to make good lagers or good IPAs in a craft setting. So that's a lot of this is actually the organizational aspects of that are kind of consuming me on a daily, quarterly, and many year basis. So it might not be up your wheelhouse, but I find it very different, and I found it personally pretty fascinating. So I'm going to try to go through those suggestions. So, hi, I'm Alex. I've been brewing since 2011 professionally. I started brewing at Lost Rhino as a shift brewer. In that time, they had a lager, which was a big draw, and because Port City and DC Brow did not. And then that's also when I bought my first wine barrel. So I've kind of been pretty into the mixed culture thing for a long period of time. I was at Bear Republic in their quality control lab, which was a fair amount of fun. There was a sour program there of some sort, which we did quality control issues on. And then I came back to DC, thought 2020 was the year. I don't say things like that, but eventually got Mieza Blendery open June 2023. And yeah, the whole concept there is essentially we don't have a brew house. So we borrow the brewing setting and focus both on a capital level and from a mental capacity level on fermentation, fruiting, packaging, aging, all in our facility in Alexandria. So you should check us out. So I really find that a blendery is a different creative approach to beer. It's kind of the idea of that, as opposed to making one unit that you treat differently at each stage, and it's kind of treated as a single unit. At Bear Republic, we would blend for a packaging run, but both those components were essentially identical. Sometimes you're blending for consistency, but you have this like true to brand, there's various parameters that you're gunning for. I think the Dick Cantwell quote is like blending for transcendence or something like that, which I'll bring up later, but it's kind of that there's actually, what beer can you make that is not, you could not achieve as a single unit? And there's some things we do that hypothetically, maybe it could have been achieved. Okay, here's a Flanders Red recipe. You add the correct inoculants. You put it in barrels for 18 months. You knock out the barrels you don't like. That's still very much a batch style format. And you'll probably get a B plus, A minus beer. But there's a lot of interesting stuff of actually kind of making diverse blending components that are then being added together that achieve something that you couldn't have done. So that's what I'm thinking about a lot. There's now in sort of the stout, I don't drink enough of this stuff. I don't have a sugar tooth, but in the large ale like Private Press and Horus, you start to listen to their process, and they're making multiple. They have 7 different sort of stout recipes that are going in different barrels. They're doubling the barrels, adding adjuncts. It's very much a blendery mentality, and I find it a lot of fun, and I would recommend it. So in a blendery, there's going to be this constant tension between diversity and fluency. So has anyone been to Trogs in Hershey? It's been like very well pre-pandemic, but I think you walk in, they have these 3 massive fooders. They might have more, I really don't know, but it's a great example of like, you can have a lot of high fluency. You can get to know those fooders very well. Not a lot of diversity in that blending stock. If you listen to New Belgium as they were kind of creating their fooder farm, they had like 60, 64. That's a fair amount of blending stock. That's also seemingly manageable, right? They did massive runs, but they had giant European fooders that they collected from various sources. If you have 3,000 wine barrels, that's a lot of potential diversity. How do you actually understand what your blending stock is? And like, I think this is entirely untested. In theory, Robert Parker in the wine world back in the day was like, he had a very good photographic memory. Whether he does or not is unclear, but he's like, oh, this reminds me of the 1983 vintage. It was very photo, just like he just remembered it clearly. Who knows what capacity people have? There might be some easy experiments to kind of test this out. But if you're good or not at that, you could still make good beers. So that's going to be the challenge. And so for professional brewers, it's probably closer to the 3,000 wine barrel. Like, hey, head brewer left. I'm the new head brewer. I have 300 barrels to taste through. I don't know their story. For most home brewing operations, it's probably more of a diversity blending stock. So if you're ever going to attempt a blendery method, it's like having enough components to blend with. Are they the right size? Are they easy to work with? Are they easy to transfer onto fruit? I think are more the concerns.
So how often would you have to taste that stock to become fluent in it, for example?
Again, I think you could experiment in terms of what the actual fluency is. It's kind of thing of like, there are things you can learn when you're tasting your IPA every day in a 21-day ferment. But some of that is like, you're getting all flustered and like, no, that goes away. Just like taste it at day 14. Okay, now I'm going to figure out what the dry hop is or something. So there's a lot of that going on. Personally, for me, I've been so caught up in breaking roll-up doors and all these types of things that I'm sort of tasting right prior and prior to usage. And so I'll get into that session like as our business has been developed as of now. I thought it was easiest to work with customers in terms of fruit, and there's a lot of interesting fruit stuff we're doing. I think they're a lot more receptive to non-fruit mixed culture things than hypothetically could have been, because I had like 2 months worth of sales data, and it's like, okay, plan out the next 2.5 years was sort of what I needed to do. So that's insane. So a lot of times I'm tasting the maturity level of like, what's our blending stock looking prior to fruiting? Because we are doing a lot of fruiting projects in the past years, probably in the next 2 years. And then it's kind of this weird balance that I'll get into of like, yes, this is maybe the best blend for this strawberry beer, this strawberry concept hypothetically, but one of those components I may want to use with great projects in early December, or September. So what has not been talked a lot about in the blending literature that exists is actually scaling, or like you're not just doing one blending session in a moment, which I'll get to, but you kind of have these hypotheses of all these different concepts, and they're sharing the whole blending stock. So you can only make one good blends in a given year for a given concept. And maybe, so that the dark stout base with wine grapes is never going to touch the spontaneous with raspberries. Those are two different concepts, but in theory, they could conflict. So it's this weird thing of, usually I'm tasting prior to the fruiting season, but if someone's has a different flow in their blending stock, it could be something else. Like I think we're starting to do a lot of beer decoupage stuff where we're pulling spontaneous stuff out of barrels because we have 600 liter punch-ins for the spontaneous stock, and I like to blend that with a lot of saisons and kind of use the aged hops, but then you're contrasting that with a bunch of different saisons as well as some of the newer, sexier New Zealand hops has been fun for me. So, but then I'm having to taste through all the saison stock to figure out what's going to maybe be a potential good blend.
So maybe we'll get to this, but
yeah.
How early do you have to have a concept to plan out what you're going to do for the year, or do you get there and you're like, I thought I was going to do X, but now I'm going to do Y because it tastes different? Because you have to set it all up like well in advance, right?
Yeah. So what I'm going to recommend in 2 slides is like, you have to start with the question of like, what do you want to be drinking 3 years from now? And you'll have a list of concepts, and then you back like, okay, that kind of means so I might jump to that real quick, but so in short, you need there's the blending stop, bridging the gap, and then how to go about a blending session are sort of the key components. So what do you want to drink 3 years from now? And that's sort of a homebrew question. This, I think, for the professional brewery that has a barrel program, this is the bigger question of, because what's the average brewer turnover in Northern Virginia? At least 2.5 years, like 2 years, 2.5 years is a long stint. Right. There's ways to go about that, but like, does your barrel program have a living will? if you will, as in terms of like when Jeff leaves, and like it was always like, here's the shift brewer that we can't pay to be a head brewer, but let them be the barrel guy. Like that's sort of like let him drift off, and like that is fun and cool. There's a lot of learning, but like this is a lot of my beers creatively have outlasted marriages in concept, you know. So it's like, but you also feel the regret a little bit of like, yeah, that was a great approach. Like I'm glad you tried that. We're stuck with this. Like this is the kid that you're dealing with, is sort of the shitty analogy. So to make it, I mean, for homebrewing it doesn't matter, right? But for the fun and experience of the blending approach, it kind of does. So the way I over summarize, and obviously these are just giant rules of thumbs, but like what am I releasing in the third year? I'm probably fruiting and packaging that in year 2. I should have brewed the base concept year 1, year 0. So I have a lot of what we call generic blonde blending stock, and a lot of those base components might be drastically different, but like I could shove them into a fruit beer if need be, and they'd be fine. But then there's a lot of great things that I could do great with. But that's sort of how I think both professional brewers and home brewers need to approach it. Is like, when is this not getting fun? When is it just too much of a chore? So, and that's where you have all these ideas, and then you're like, well, how much do I actually want to brew? Like, do I have enough fermenters? Are they the right size? And a lot of this is scaling. And on the homebrew level, there might be an easy, happy medium of like, if you have a 10-gallon system, does that mean you just always split that into 2.5 gallon? But it's like, how much of a batch size do you want for the fruit? If it's, I mean, I'd totally recommend going out and picking, like pick your own might have a lot of awesome potential. Like, I don't know what you're looking for in the fruit, but that's something that I'm putting a lot of effort in. Like, how are we manipulating the fruit in the field? I can pay for it, but like, how can we change the process? Because like in Napa, they're culling 50% of the wine grapes to make an A+ wine. It's like, what's the blueberry equivalent? Economically, I can make up for that. And so maybe, like, I don't know what you're looking for when you're picking raspberries, but you have it in your hands. But it's still, you picked 10 pounds worth of raspberries. That's like a full day. It's totally worth it, but are you going to do that for peaches too? So these are the type of things that I think you actually need to scale. And then are some of these concepts really relying on very unique recipes? Like, so a blonde sour, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. There's a lot of things that fall under that. I've been trying to play with kind of different malt bills, and that requires me to brew a whole batch as opposed to just, so that's 12 BB, like 31 gallon is what I'm bringing in. And if it's a pseudo rye wine and it fails, like, how do I make up for that? So that's a big consideration that I think from those top, what am I drinking year 3? How does it boil down to year 2 and year 1? And does it all fit?
So there's a lot more investment, I would say, up front, right? Because you're planning a 3-year schedule as opposed to what I can drink right now or this year, right?
Yeah. And so that's like, just invest in the system that you're comfortable with.
So I'm curious, the years are split out due to logistics, or is it due to that's maturity time for the beer itself?
It's it's amazing how much maturity time is making less and less sense to me.
Okay.
Where like brewers have passed, and like I was brewing into that, like regularly brewing all these beers, and like year 2 maturity meant something to me in 2025 or 2015. Yeah. And honestly, now it's a lot vaguer, where as I've been making these beers, flavor maturity between year 1 and year 2 has not been that great. I'm doing nothing different, but then also at the same time, there's a million things I want to play with or try. It's like, okay, just fruit this or like whatever. So that's a giant puzzle that I just, as a company, I can't fixate on, but also just like, yeah, there's something else you can try and something else you can focus on that feels innovative for me, or feels progressive. But it's been amazing how much maturity has been a long conversation, and all the forums, all the podcasts forever. And now it's like, is it 9 months? Probably fine. Yeah. And I am experimenting, like spontaneous, that doesn't seem to be as much the case. I am looking back at my notes. It's like, why is this behaving this way now when I had 7 years where year 2.5 was bringing to something to the table, and I was actively aging, like flying back from California to do some sort of weird fruit project with 2.5-year-old stuff versus, so it's very weird, but it's like I just kind of roll with the punches at this stage. But I have no idea.
Okay.
And there's a couple areas of like, I thought I had an understanding and it's not coming to fruition that way, nor is it a crisis.
Yeah.
But it is still puzzling of like, no, this is how it exists. It's not existing. Just move forward. Yeah, so whenever I would really recommend, I mean, the fun of a blendery is that if you're stressing about a malt bill, it's just a blending component. So, you know, I did like a sour quad base of some sort. We threw an extra bag of like what was, I think, chocolate malt. We couldn't have, it tasted great. We couldn't have, if we tried to sell that, say that was like a Belgian quad, we couldn't have. But this is getting blended, so it just doesn't matter. But whenever you're trying something risky, for instance, if I'm trying newer malt-based stuff, let's say it's a sour quad or a rye wine, where it's like, who knows what these different, like what Munich rye actually tastes like and what quantities. If I have 2 different Flanders red recipes that are kind of, you know, have worked well in the past, that's an easy blend out. So, and that's kind of where, for us, where we have limited capacity and like, who knows what people want to drink. It's like we'll do 3 or 4 like stout-based-esque batches. So we have almost like an Uber Doppelbock, like 15% alcohol. It's a lot of fun to play with. I don't know if we'd leave it alone, but that's where we have almost an imperial stout, also too much roast. But if we have 3 of these, we can kind of find a happy place. So, but as a home brewer, it's like you're dedicating yourself to a red season probably, like unless you're brewing like 3 different, you know, Flanders or like red bases, 3 different dark bases, 8 different blonde bases. But as long as you're thinking of this theoretically, I think it will make you happy in the long run. If there's a kind of rule of thumb that I'm starting to apply is my best practices that I'm like, oh yeah, this is the way to go, are only functioning 80% of the time. It's almost like Newtonian physics only functions 80% of the time. But once you know that, it's like, okay, well, it's like I have 4 of those, like let's hedge this way. And so there's a lot of, if you're going to shoot this batch or you're going to split this batch into super sour, medium sour, no sour. So an easy, but again, imperfect is sort of like adding them just a very strong lactic acid producing culture, you know, pre-ferment. One is, maybe the middle ground is having like a lagering Saison yeast that then stalls out, add, and then only have basically like a Saison Brett. So that way, and especially if a unique malt bill, you have that acid spectrum. But so all these things are just like very sort of judiciously and like applied at a theoretical level that you're projecting out in 3 years from now. And it's all potentially going to fall apart. But it's nice to overplan in these scenarios. And I think it's more fun when you do so.
So you say there that best practices only work 80% of the time.
Yeah.
Is that because of the vagaries of this is a living organism, this is something that is changing on the fly?
Yeah. That and like no one's paying me to really double and like make sure. But like your average IPA or lager producer is getting it 99% of the time easily. Yeah. And that we're used to that as like methodical homebrewers, and like the EverQuest, like this is my 49th batch of my favorite ESB. That beauty, it's like if you want that, that just doesn't exist. And I think that will almost never exist. So it's like just walk away from, like, I think the next quote is, so don't let making better beers distract from making the best blends. So there's fun, but like that urge of just like, you know, German control that is so much of fun of home brewing, I think you'd actually leave at the door and instead focusing on what you can achieve in the blending scenario when they're just components. You know, it's just another cog in the wheel. Is a focus. So once you have all those concepts, you're like, oh, do they actually make sense together? And you're like, well, like no, this is a shit ton of like spontaneous beer, and I've never brewed a spontaneous beer. Like, so you kind of like hedge like whether you think it's like all these concepts fit and maybe knock one out, or like, no, I'm just going to brew extra, or like it fits this whole schedule that you're actually going to achieve it. Then there's kind of the health in the blending stock in itself. So it's like, do you have a good acidity spectrum amongst all the blonde-esque bases? And the thing is, like, maybe if you think of it, I couldn't draw a bell curve in here, and this is when I like got pretty sad. Like, it's like, because that should be like, imagine like, of your concepts, there's a 50%, like it's just a classic bell curve where like we're shooting for medium sour, and it turns out the medium sour actually was not that sour. Then you're relying on the other 25% to balance out that. So for some of these aspects of like aged hops, are you really getting a full spectrum? Like acidity is probably one that you could achieve easily and want to achieve. Yeah. Sorry? I mean, yeah, then there's the other, like, look, fruiting. And so, raspberries are always, so there's a ton of malic acid. You should always, and then like different brewers really can achieve different types of funk and how they classify that. So these categories are not gospel by any means, but other brewers will kind of think of their blending stock in a certain way. I was listening to another brewer that they're basically taking the full hazy IPA, like flowables, cryo thing, throwing it in there. And like, I haven't tasted their beer, but they were kind of thinking of it as like overly pungent, like rotting fruit. But that they use that as a blending component in terms of hops. So, but I would, and this is maybe for home brewing, it's a little, you probably want things more closely tied to end results. But there's certain flavors that are, I find that are just cool and I want to propagate. So like, if you discover cinnamon, like cooking for the first time, like, oh, I just want more of that around. I don't have a project for this. So like, garlic is just good. And so there's similar things. It's like, no, I want to keep this propagated. I'll find a home for it eventually. Maybe there's a concept in year 3 that I just never thought could exist because I didn't know what garlic was. And then also what I'm a big proponent of is so human selection. So everyone talks about lambic, but there's actually no official method where they're taking on really cool mixed culture flavors and propagating that. They're simply going through the cool shit motions, and like maybe they're not cleaning a barrel when they said they would or something like that. But that's sort of the romance that I've had a lot of fun with. And so I don't believe in a direct house culture. A lot of times we're taking a favorite barrel at a given time and leaving that to propagate a new batch. Other brewers have done this, and what's kind of funny is like there is like this one strain of culture that I'm doing this stuff wine. It's like, it's barrel 31. I don't know what's in it, but it's like, so eventually I have to step back of like, I have this culture that has been with me for close to forever. But in terms of blind barrel tasting of like what I want to propagate, that is getting pushed forward. I'm introducing new cultures. We're kind of at this time in sour beer where there's a lot of prominent producers that they were manipulating cultures for a decade and they ceased to exist. So it is kind of fun to pass stuff on. I don't have a lot of data, but both in-house, I'm realizing that the acidity might not be the same, but a lot of the aromatics from a given culture seems to come from dregs pretty well. Kind of at that 80% rate. So I had one weird Saison that was different. Sorry?
Comes from what?
So taking the dregs of another producer and propping those up, the aromatics carry on. And like the acid of that culture will depend on the hopping or other things, but the aromatics will stick around majority of the time. So if you have a favorite beer, I'd recommend actually just, lambic is a prime example if you don't get that full lambic funk. They're excellent dregs coming out of a lambic bottle, but that doesn't reciprocate. But a lot of these other producers, like you do kind of get their character. So we are introducing as sort of like a giant floating arc in space, in isolation. We're still introducing cultures, we're still manipulating cultures, and that's sort of this is the beauty of domestication, if we can think of it that way. So another thing so these are areas that manipulating a blending stock is a different mindset than standard brewing. So I already approached kind of the first two, that don't worry too much about the recipe development. It's going to be the blend in the end. So making a better beer and trying to make a better beer will never hurt as long as it's not taking the focus away from the end blending and the organizational aspects of getting to good blends. Another weird thing is that, when Firestone Walker figures out how to make the best like Pivo pills, that system is gonna make the best Pivo pills that time. It's gonna make the best Pivo pills anytime. And in the blending world, there's actually kind of a couple instances where, as long as you may take a risk that might give you high results, but then it also might fail. And as long as you're cognizant of that and you kill it, no one knows. And so that's a different thing than kind of standard brewing process. And so my analogy, as opposed to like public health, where it's like, oh, it's like 74 or 75 is the average life expectancy of a male. There are alternatives that may exist where it's kind of more of a Stalinistic, like, yeah, everyone's dying at 47, but we have like 20 times the LeBron Jameses in our population. So a common example is that topping up every 6 months the barrels you're killing the barrel diversity because you're all blending it together, but you're totally going to help out the overall population health. And so that's something I've juggled with, of like, there may be the risk this one barrel does die, but I want to preserve the diversity. Now I'm kind of doing a mix of like, okay, these are all tasting the same. These ones are different. I'm going to use these barrels. I'm going to prop with this barrel. The ones that all tasted kind of similar, I'm going to reblend and rebarrel where there's no oxygen exposure. Another weird thing is in Alexandria compared to, Loudoun County, compared to DC home basement, I'm getting a lot of evaporation that I'm not sure where it's coming from. So I'm just like, wow, this is evaporated a lot more than I experienced. And then another weird thing is like, are you trying to make the best blend with your favorite beer, or are you trying to propagate with it? And then another reality is that when everything goes right, because you have all these contingencies, like stuff just gets left in the dust. And it is remarkable how much you can be like, oh, but I have a new project for this. And like, you can totally make great beers doing that. But I think you're eventually going to burn out when you're constantly chasing. It's like, oh, we used all the Doppelbock and none of the stout. What are we going to brew to make up for the stout? And like, you can do that within reason, but if you're chasing the tail too much, it's going to break down on you. So from an environmental standpoint, I don't like it. But if you're trying to actually be a great blendery, you're leaving stuff behind. It's not that things necessarily had off flavors. They just didn't find a home because you appropriately balanced your blending stock. So the next stage is, how do you go from this blending stock to one or multiple blends? And for home brewers, I think that's less of a consideration. What I wanted to have a better sense of is like a recommendation of like, what blending stock diversity should you be dealing with? And I think for me personally, when I had 10 different carboys to blend with, that was a big awakening. It's like, oh, there's all this, and like, it's like, I'll do this with the blueberries, this with the peaches. But I don't have a justification where that number came, but like 10 to 15. And so whether that's 1 gallon carboys or 2.5, and then the other thing is like, how are you extracting this stuff well? And so I think, maybe not with you guys, but there's all this thing of like, your time is the most expensive thing in the DC area. So it's like, do what's fun, are you achieving the project or not? But like, build a system where like, yeah, it's absurd that you spent this much money. I don't know how to do a 1 barrel system well, but it's like, if you have it easily, it's like, are you just pushing, like if you have extra like, soda kegs, because a lot of what I'm doing personally is I just get everything off the fruit and then blend when I have patience and time. But I'm keeping a ton of stuff in stainless for like 3 months until I can find it. Like, I would strongly recommend that, because the blending is the fun. Why rush it when like, this is done, this is done, this is done? Because we only have 1 tank, we're moving this project forward. But things to think about are pH, gravity. Titratable acidity is becoming oddly more important to me, where I used to think pH and titratable acidity were very similar, but I'm actually having packaging issues where the pH was like 3.5, like not very high. The titratable acidity was like 17, which kind of, and it was slow to actually carbonate.
Can you define what titratable is?
Yeah, so it's basically, it takes all the acids and converts it to one number. So it can be if you send it out to a lab, it's like tartaric or it takes all the acids, converts it to one. what I was talking to a chemist in our tasting room, and they basically found that like acetic acid, malic acid, we'd all consider more intense acids. And apparently it's not molecular weight, but it's something similar that equation does make sense. So if you think, like, I think warheads are phosphoric and malic acid. They're like deep, intense acids. Acetic it's also deep and intense, but that's vinegar. So that's a different thing. So titratable acidity equates all those to one number. Ideally, I think you'd get the percentage, but that probably requires a GC mass spec. If you just had like a regular like spectrometer or whatever, like you can do just lactic acid tests and then make a ratio of the titratable acidity, and that would basically probably tell you whether you have either something interesting going on, but probably whether you have acetic or ethyl acetate. So I forget what lab was doing that. It's still probably out of your guys' range a little bit, but yeah, because mainly the beer acid's going to be lactic acid. So if there's any oddness in ratio, that's implying something else is going on. And if you're going from 3,000 barrels to 20 for a blend, that would be helpful. But also there's probably practices that would prevent acetic acid or ethyl acetate. And then, so what I don't have a good recommendation on now that I'm trying to work for is tasting notes, systemic tasting notes, but like, off flavors, interesting character. The note, as opposed to just writing what the thing tastes like, probably have directional notes as to how this would be used and thinking of it that way. If you have 20 carboys, that's less of an issue. But so again, I'm assuming, and I would not recommend that most homebrewers get into wood aging, because it's just like I've made plenty of great beer in carboys, and that's not going to go bad nearly as easily. Just having one giant barrel, it's a lot of investment in one blending component. But what's for professional brewers that are using wine barrels, it's this weird data thing of like, you be collecting data on the wood barrel and just what beers have gone through that, whether you liked it, what's the life cycle, what was the cleaning treatment, because cleaning the barrel is its own form of inoculation. So if you steam versus ozone versus hot water rinse versus a cold water rinse versus just putting wort or primary fermented beer in, that's all different forms of inoculation. So keeping track of that might be beneficial. And the one thing I would warn also is, like, I'm keeping a lot of data, or should be. It's written down somewhere. But a lot of it's like, this is like good to have, but I don't think we should be treating it on a reactional standpoint. So for instance, whenever I fill wine barrels off the fermenter, I label the first one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then eventually, like 4 years in, I'm just going to look and like, what were the positive tasting notes over, like, qualitatively from fill 1, fill 4, and like, oh, there's a giant pattern here. Like, but I'm not going to do that in the first year and then determine a process. But it's like, oh, the lees or whatever actually apparently over 35 batches is pretty substantial. But so basically I have a spreadsheet that's keeping track of the batch, when the pH was read, titratable acidity, gravity, tasting notes, versus that's also going, but the barrel is being treated separately. So it's less of a homebrew concern probably, but I think pretty important.
How long can you keep a barrel going?
So in general, we try to really use red wine neutral. So we're not looking for obvious oak. A puzzle that I need to figure out more is that a lot of the lambic producers are intentionally using neutral oak. Like I think, is it Decam and like Dry Fontaine, like had Pilsner or Kell barrels that they stripped the pitch out of, when the wall fell, and they've been using them. But eventually they said the barrel's dead. And I've never heard any other explanation of what that means, because it's supposed to be neutral. They're using it for multiple generations. It doesn't seem like they're implying a structural failure of that punch-in. They're not, but also when you listen to them, as well as American, like Allagash is of this kind of camp, that like a lot of the mutual characters of the batch of the cool ship. So batch 1 amongst barrel A, B, and C is more similar than batch 1 and batch 2 in barrel A. So I don't know if I explained that well, but like, because I was all like, if you asked me in 2012, I was far more convinced that the barrel was giving the character. And other brewers have used that effectively. A lot of the modern Belgian lambic producers that kind of took over a hobby, like Tilken, it's not just the producers that are trying to build up a romance. They very much seemingly find a lot of similarity amongst the cool ship batch itself. But I'm outdated on this, but also now with like PCR, where they can genetically tag these different microbes. I think both in an Allagash study, these are probably like 2018, and a Cantillon study, what's kind of puzzling is if you look at the spectrum of fermentation from day 0 to year 3, there's all this weird little pops of different microbes that have their moment for a week and a half or so and then go dormant. That I think people would argue, and I'm sympathetic to, actually make precursors for flavors later on that if you just use dregs from a lambic bottle, you're never getting. But basically after 6 months in Cantillon and Allagash, there's this dance of Pediococcus and Brettanomyces from like 6 months, I think, to like 3 years. And they've never found those microbes in the actual cool ship. But then all these producers, again, are finding so much similarity amongst the cool ship, the individual cool ship brethren or whatever. So, and what's kind of funny is like, Cantillon showed no lactobacillus in the one study they did. Like Allagash had like a 3 week, like had like a little blip at 3 weeks and went away. But this is also the same time when everyone's making kettle sours to lactobacillus. And like in theory, that microorganism never found its way into lambic, according to that, these two studies. So, yeah. I think that answered the question, right? Okay, I got a little lost. But so the next step that I think is a little tricky is going from blending stock to individual blends. So if you have 20 carboys and like 5 concepts, like maybe that's not too hard. If someone left you a lot of barrels, or if your customers maybe expect 25, 26 releases a year, that might get a little more complicated. So usually, as I kind of said, for us, we're still fruiting a lot of beer. So in May, before most of the concept outside of strawberries, we are tasting through almost everything. And it's this weird kind of game of matching all these different hypotheses of a blend. So for wine grapes, it might be like one of those projects is we want to kind of have a dark base. So I only have 3 candidates for that. So it's like this year we basically had almost like a rye wine expression and like a 15% Doppelbock expression. And so the idea is like, do I want to do one of those, just rye wine with like, we did a Bordeaux blend of like 50% Cab Sauv, 25% Merlot, and 25% Cab Franc, which apparently wasn't a choice for me this year. But it was like, hey, it turns out like, I think it was 2/3 like Doppelbock and 1/3. But that was kind of an easy, but like, the blonde base, it's like, okay, what do we want to use? And like, I want something with more heft. And that could fall under like, okay, the aged hops is providing more heft, like a higher acid, like maybe higher acid would be that, maybe something with more body that had a shit ton of oats. There's a lot of things that could fall under that are not being used for, say, the stone fruit, where it's like kind of stone fruity character, something like in general, half the peaches are flabby, and some of them are not, but depending, I'm trying new varietals every year. So it's like something that may have more structure for that blend. So what I think has not been shown up the literature is I'm essentially blending, I'm having to balance priorities from a bunch of different concepts. And they're all sharing the same stock of beer. And that has not shown up in a lot of the books. And for instance, for the Saison projects, I basically brew a like there's a recipe, there's one mixed culture, it goes into 6 wine barrels roughly. I'm picking amongst those 6 wine barrels. So if I'm going to use some of that in a project, I probably want to make the Saison blend first, at least theoretically. And if that's based on one outlier barrel, they're all kind of the same. And that's also the assumption that probably works most of the time. If you're making a fruited beer, it's not. It's almost the analogy of using like a single barrel Scotch or bourbon. It's like, no, a bottled in bond could probably achieve the same thing in a Manhattan or close to it. So usually I'll do sort of a preliminary blend of testing the big concepts with one representative barrel, which may fail because the one representative barrel may be an outlier for that full batch. Then from that, like there might be hard nose with concepts, and then I'll go to, it's like, okay, I think I found the balance between the rye wine and the Doppelbock. Let's taste all 6 barrels of each and see if there's giant outliers that want to change my perspective, or just pick the best, or do I need the best for something else? Then there's sort of the initial blending session where I think, I'll get into this a bit, but there's a lot of what I'm realizing is there's something between, there's called relative discrimination versus absolute. And relative is kind of you just saying yes, no, or yes, I like this, no, I don't. Absolute is actually applying, no, I taste raspberry. And that's based on memory and a bunch of other stuff. So at initial blending session, I think it makes sense to be reliant on just kind of raw discrimination that you'd experience in a triangle test. So in quality control, what's very common with Budweiser is there's basically, they'll give you 3 samples, 2 of them same, one's different. So you're testing something. If you can't tell the difference, then they disregard your information. The people that are part of these tasting panels might be the person like clocking people in, or accounting. They're not brewers often, but they've been established as being very good at just discriminating. So I'll get to that in a sec. So a big thing is essentially in a blendery, there's not a lot of objective measures. I think every brewer tells you that they taste their beer before they send it out, but there's at Bear Republic, there's so many things dialed in that if something just got canned and never got tasted at the bright tank or the bottling line, they always did. But I don't think that would be a nightmare. The equivalent I could never do. So I think there's always going to be a sensory component. But essentially tasting notes are pretty bad as we've developed them in the Western world. But I think they're more essential in general. Yet in the actual blending, I think we're going to be reliant on that just relative discrimination. So in general, going through the process of applying language allows us to smell better, and it's completely independent of our like genetic makeup or whatever, like our nose. It's not that a perfumer has a better nose. They've often been just trained to do a specific task well. And so that's really recommended, and that's why like Untapped in retrospect really sucks, because we're not applying anything. We're just like, we're gaining badges and random numbers. But there's a lot of the research shows you can recognize scents at a lower threshold when you start sniffing and applying language. 2 distinct scents that are very similar, you can distinguish more. You can just do it better consistently. So it's always great to apply language. But in the actual blending process, I kind of advise against it, which we'll get to in a sec. Yeah, so I kind of went over that. But there's a book called Smellosophy, which I think it was a 2021 publication. It's not good to do on an audiobook on a bike, but what they kind of get into that I think is the underlying science behind what my recommendation was absolute discrimination versus relative. So absolute discrimination is the ability to identify a stimulus in isolation. For example, when you identify a given odorant as minty and describe its quality as being green, cool, fresh. In relative discrimination, the task is to tell whether 2 stimuli are the same or different, or whether one of the 2. These 2 processes, absolute and relative discrimination, perform different kinds of perceptual judgment with measurably different functions and performance. So this is a quote from a guy that basically was just testing deodorants. It's like people that can't even understand they're like tasting juicy fruit gum will still give it like an 8.5 versus a 6.3. Humans are great. There's almost like when you make any different blend, scientists, like you can almost always detect it, even from lay people. Absolute discrimination involves the assignment of conceptual content, such as the quality of an object, an object type, or a scene. The former process is a sensory evaluation of stimuli, features in, I can't read anymore. But basically it's relying on memory and also our internal categorization. But also all that expertise in sommeliers and perfumers is learned. But what I don't know to what extent is, what's weird about smell is the more we apply it and apply language or get used to it, we're shaping our own reality. Smell is a lot more computational. So the context of this room is shaping what I smell outside of the independent things that whatever the chemical makeup of this beer is. And so I think when you become, if you want to become a sommelier, that's, whether that tradition in wine makes sense or not, or is good or bad, if you want to make 80K a year doing it or 120K, this is what you need to do. And perfumers, are you going to be making perfumes for people or are you not? Blending sour beer, I don't think is as structured. And so what is good, what is bad, and what are you training to? Because it's almost like you learn how to paint a certain way and you see the world a different way. So I'm a little, in terms of developing categories for absolute discrimination, it totally would make a better blender. We don't have a good understanding of what a better blender is. So where I'm nervous about applying too much absolute discrimination in blending is, in general, when you're blending, and I don't know to what extent, and I'm trying to figure out more of a scientific backing of this, is you're getting fatigue and assimilation from all these different blending. And also you don't know when you're making a bad blend. So if you're doing the triangle test, you know when you're getting it wrong. If you call a wine no, this is Burgundy 2024, you know when it's wrong. When you're writing a beer advocate post, you don't know when it's wrong necessarily, but that's still the qualitative. And another thing that I'm really focused on is that a lot of what is making a good blend and also a good beer, but no one teaches me how to do it, is there's a lot of compositional tasting notes. So it's not just that whether flavors exist, I'm smelling blueberry in the thing or not, or ethyl acetate, but it's when do these flavors clash or fill the same palate space or not? And no one teaches you how to brew that way. You can kind of brew for intensity, add more hops, you'll get more, or do this different process. But in blending, you can be aware of these things when they exist and when they don't. And there's a lot of times where I think, oh, this flavor and that flavor would work, but they're clashing in the moment. So you can be aware of that, and I think that's super important. But also that's requiring double the language that we currently have. If we don't have the language, that's where relative discrimination is better than some sort of absolute compositional. And then there's also something weird that I need to research more called the Lang limit, which is essentially saying when we smell something, we can only figure out 3 to 5 notes if we're trained. But whether we can make a judgment of 10 different blends where we're not identifying things is something that, or if we just come back the next day and if you take tasting notes on this stout, and I can really only list 3 real things. If I come back the next day from the same admixture, can I pick up something that did exist? And so I haven't read this paper, but there's a number of people that have. So in general, with blending session notes, I think we should be doing that relative discrimination. You should note what you like, what you don't, and what the direction is. And you're never going to completely not have absolute discrimination. You're always thinking about these things in qualitative things that apply words. But as opposed to writing paragraphs about each blend, I think it's much better yes, no, not, directional, and then you can come up later as to what you think the theory was behind that. So years back, recall is basically a thing I was saying previously of absolute. So, to call a wine, you do need absolute, but you're also getting checked on it. Triangle test, that's strictly relative discrimination, but if you're right or not. Blending session, it could be relative, but you don't know when things are going bad. And then, sort of reviewing a product. And also, is it evolving on you? Are you getting fatigued is another aspect. And in a blending session, there's multiple samples, so it's probably more. I couldn't find it, but I've run across it repeatedly where both in mice and humans, if we're tasting similar things and there's something new, our brain's very good at picking out the new thing in the admixture, but if something's replaced from that mixture, we're not as aware. So we're kind of getting this general vibe, but we're good at figuring out like, oh, this beer is slightly different, but we do lose track of if something got stripped away that was there previously. So could you develop a blending system to account for that? Like probably. So I was talking about the compositional side. Things that I don't have a lot of good words for and no one does, but, things like structure, does the beer evolve from beginning, middle, and end? Are they working in conjunction? Some beers for me just have a lot more space on the palate, and scientifically I have no idea what that means. But it's something I'm aware of, and my analogy is that if you took like 5 Oktoberfests from regional brewers, the actual flavor notes in this area of you're going to get very similar Marzen type notes. But there's going to be, outside of off flavors, there's going to be a winner and a loser, and those are probably compositional. And so I don't know how to brew for that. Maybe, water profile seems to bring up these things of where flavors hit on the palate, where they don't. But in blending, you can totally be aware of that. So this is something that's a little half-baked, but essentially, this is whatever the beer is, this is how our brain perceives it. This is not a hierarchy of importance, but all these things kind of need a building block. So everyone kind of focuses on note identification when it comes to tasting notes. And I think more of these compositional things, but justifying what rules in composition we should be paying attention to or not. I think, and then characterization is like the overall character. So I usually try to apply all of these in a given tasting note for a beer, not in a blending session. So again, there's that Lang limit that essentially says we're only able to taste. There's a cap of things we can perceptually taste. And so the questions I have are, if we just revisit it, if we taste the same thing 10 times on 10 different days, are we gonna pick up things in that admixture that are theoretically there, but our brain can only get 3 to 5 at a time? And then if we're only doing relative discrimination, are we making yes/no decisions on blends that even though we can't identify why we're doing it? So I'm unsure, but that's the benefit of the relative discrimination in the blending session, where you're making a lot of trials and you're saying yes/no as opposed to theorizing what you're tasting and trying to identify what you're tasting. This is a Dick Cantwell quote that I like a lot. Well, I don't like it in the sense that I thought I could come up with an alternative, and I haven't yet, but less explainable to those who haven't done it is the Spirit Quest approach of total immersion and intuitive tightrope walking, where one's intimate knowledge of each individual beer and barrel is the only tool one takes to the process naked. Once you've done it, you can't come back down. It's pretty true. It is kind of a very trippy experience. So it is kind of mystical in the sense that these flavors appear and they don't, and there's kind of a scientific backing for that. The intuitive tightrope walk is this sort of like, you have an idea in mind, but then you're just getting buffeted by the realities of the base blend. And then, immersion, you do need the fluency initially of the components, but also it is a different mental state that I don't have any recommendations for. But, don't do it in obnoxious places. Don't do it with other people. I think it should be you alone, because a lot of this is not, it's either subjective or there isn't a language, and you need to make this, it's more about decision making as opposed to narration. So for each of these blending ideas, there's like, okay, what's the project? There might be multiple hypotheses of how you achieve that. You kind of gather maybe a couple candidates, and then you might do a preliminary blending session where you test those out. This is the blending session where it's more reliant. But after the blending session, I think after you say the yes/nos, you try to make up a theory as to what you were tasting, what you liked, sort of a post-game. And then does that lead to a next blending session that's more investigatory? Or I would always recommend at least 2 blending sessions where you thought you figured it out, but you're basically coming back, you make the top candidate blends, and you blind taste them and select your favorites. And if it's still gelling, then you can go forward with it. If it's not, and if you listen to like what's his name? Perkins at Allagash. It's like all these guys that like they come off of a 10-hour meeting day. They need to make that blend that night. And what I really thought you really can't do this stuff under pressure well. So I really recommend it's like there's no pressure, there's no canning. Like if the blend's not ready, if you haven't gotten around to it, you can't push it because it's like a kid, like it's around you for a long time. Yeah. So again, this is sort of where you might apply absolute versus relative discrimination. So a preliminary blend of like, what is the ratio of rye to Doppelbock? That's kind of an easy 1-2 test. Then you pull out all the different blending components to see what you think would work the best. That initial blending session, you might be doing more quick trials and saying yes, no, and then sort of a post-op, like what do you think about it? And then the final confirmation blend. I don't have a good idea of how many blending samples you should deal with, but I think around maybe 10 to 12 is where but I do want a science-based thing of that. It's probably usually, I think what Lauren, I guess was Salazar from New Belgium, that's like, I kind of do a quick flyby where you're just tasting and sniffing, maybe only sniffing candidates. And then either if there's a character pieces that you're intrigued by, but you try a couple blends and see how those go. And then a lot of times you'll have a couple things that gain dominance so there's one barrel or 2 barrels that you think, and then it's like, how do I adjust this? Whether it's acidity or overall funk. I don't believe in blending to volume, but that's a consideration of a lot of other people. And then the notation I use is I'll basically, again, we're trying to go very quickly. So it's the sample number and the parts amount. And then this phase of like, what do I think that barrel was achieving? Whether that's, it was rye heavy, medium acid, and like in retrospect, what this barrel could be doing in the moment. That might be why I chose it. But in fact, it just had a lot of body. And there could be an entirely different barrel that could hold the body side of it. So again, after the blending session, that's where you have this sort of like narration of what you think was happening, what you want to try. So you have a ranking of what you thought was good, but then do you need to go back to the blending stock? And all of this is going to be reliant on sort of more absolute discrimination thoughts. And then what has been kind of fun is like sometimes if there's a common thread, I've thought of what the alternative entirely would be and flip it's on its head. Like 1 out of 8 times that actually does make a big difference of like, the base spirit was bourbon and you just flip it with the vermouth and like, does that work? The equivalent kind of has shown, and then it's, in kind of a cocktail thing. It's like switch out the base spirit and like, yeah, that was the good move, but like everything shifts a little bit because of that. And then the confirmation blends is sort of coming back. What do you think the prominent candidate, like if there are different angles that would have gone to different places, which ones did you like? And then like, what were the top 3 or 4 theoretical blends, and just taste them all blind and see if what you're feeling is confirmed. So that was an hour long, guys. I'm really sorry. But I haven't presented in a while. So so that's sort of the organizational stuff of the mixed culture beer program. And sorry about the time, but I haven't done this in a while.
So I have some questions.
Do you, how do I say this to make sense? Because it made sense in my head a minute ago. So do you take how do I say this? When you're tasting things, or when you're trying to find out, does something taste right for this blend, do you get to a point where you don't taste anything for quite a while, and then maybe you taste some things like every day or every week or whatever, and then all of a sudden things move quickly? Is there like a change in the variability of how things change for a blend?
So honestly, I don't know. because I'm too far behind. But in general, it's like, oh, like I tasted something a month or two, and usually it hasn't changed that dramatically. So there's kind of these moments where like in May, I'll taste through almost everything. And then I'll do confirmations on the grape stuff in September. But usually the main principle with those beers has not changed as these beers have been made. But I think other people have suggested differently, where they're saying, within 2 months, something's very different. And for me, it hasn't. What is interesting is a lot of our Saisons were basically the 6 to 9 months in barrel, between 6 to 9 months. That's whether I've gotten around to packaging it. But we'll dry hop that's where all the funk's coming from in bottle, and the stuff that never got packaged goes on a complete different journey, where it gets a lot more sour, a lot more like just stone fruit peachy that just never existed in the dry hop alternative. That was packaged.
So do you find yourself making like a calendar that fits your production more than making sure that you're getting something on a specific day or a specific time frame to hit a specific, taste?
Yeah, so a little bit is there's a couple seasonal aspects that will dictate when we're tasting through stuff and when we're using it. So the fruiting session, if we're using a Saison, yeah, it's probably going to be fine in a month. And then a lot of times, like we're doing a lot of beer decoupage kind of projects where we're blending spontaneous beer with Saisons. And that's like some of those Saisons might be on different time frames, but like whatever the blend makes sense is how we're thinking about it. Yeah. As opposed to being like this the maturity of the beer is second nature, or is secondhand for us in terms of the seasonality of the other things that are being ready or not. So it's like the fruit's there, you got to put something on fruit.
Because I would think that what you do is different in time than what a main brewery would do, because they're trying to hit something that is literally counted in days, whereas your stuff is months and seasons.
A lot of the Saison concepts are not improving after a year as we're making them, but they seem to be there at 6 months, maybe not 4 months, but I'm more behind on this. So it's like 4 months. It's like maybe I could make a system that we could package this stuff at 3 months, but we haven't. The pressure of the business has not been applied to getting this stuff out the door as much as like making sure we pay our excess taxes and like we're getting beer on fruit and off fruit. Yeah.
So where's the fruit coming from? Are you doing more local
farmers
or more commercial based?
No, pretty much all, I think 98% by volume is, so like I have a grapefruit thing that I just got like 40 pounds of grapefruit puree because it was like a tiny touch, and I did zest from like an organic market, but yeah, pretty much all the brambles are coming from Agriberry outside Richmond, like northeast of Richmond, that a lot of those producers have used. And then stone fruits are a farm in Winchester and a farm close to Wintergreen. And it's less about the localism or using Virginia as opposed to trying to build relationships with farmers, where I think there's a lot of, for stone fruits, it seems like all these different varieties of peaches like do kind of behave very differently. Not drastically, but like there's different, and nothing on the internet tells you what the aromatics are, because the sugar ferments out. The fruit acid's important, but it's not, you can blend the total acidity up and down with base beer. So it's what aromatics are sticking around, and farmers have never really been required to ask that. If you look at the people, like all the breeding programs in New Jersey or wherever, it's like nice peach flavor. It's like, it's all agroeconomics and like fruit, like, which is important, but it's amazing. So, and also I guess I don't eat enough fruit. So, but so the discovery right now, what we're really doing is like try a bunch of peaches and make a blend amongst how those peaches turn out. Cause like, it's just as dramatic seemingly compared to like Merlot versus Cab Franc or other wine varietals is how things have been behaving. Yeah. So, and then can we pick late? Can we only do one variety of raspberry? Those are the conversations that working local means, as opposed to some sense of terroir, which has some relevance, but this is really more questions of like domestication than sense of place. And then the floating arc of the human manipulated microbes over decades. So as opposed to just like of place terroir conversations.
So you see, you aim for a range of sours. There's a section of beers that are non-soured at all. It's just a blend of different base beers.
Maybe 10%, and maybe that's like some sort of saison with a Brett strain, or just a culture. And then so you can manipulate it with hopping. But again, I'm going to get all these wrong. But that's the hunch of like, there's some things that are dedicated super sour. Maybe I achieved that or not. A lot of things dedicated middle of the road. A lot of things dedicated non-sour. Each of those shots might get off, but that was the intention. And like hopefully the spectrum is there. And where I've kind of fucked up is like I had a very unique malt blend that I thought I split a couple different ways that it didn't quite turn out. But that was, of 6 barrels as opposed to of 40 or something like that. So
Where do you end up getting your, like, what's the furthest place that you end up getting your beers to blend?
So I was working with Dynasty Brewing. So, which like I was just friends with Fabio. I think he's coming to help me out in the blending in the blendery, which would be fun. I started with Great Maine in Haymarket because they're like Josh and Amy are like live really close to the tasting room, so it's like 10 barrel batches and like in theory like the mash filter system might have been interesting, but Hellbender closed down, and then I'm not really like there's a couple of decoction concepts that might be fun. But I think it might just be like Lost Rhino that's able to do that in the area.
I mean, where do you end up getting your beers from?
Like drinking or?
No. To blend.
So I'm getting, these are all wort producers. So I'm doing all the fermentation. I'm doing a lot of the actual wort production, whether that's legal. I think, so someone's supervising them, but I'm brewing on other people's systems. And I don't think the brewing setups that I'm currently using are providing that. There could be a lot of diversity in brewing systems that would be fun to play with, and I'm not taking advantage of that. I don't think the DMV probably has that much to offer in terms of brew house diversity.
So you're not actually getting beers from other breweries from far off places?
No, I'm licensed as a brewery, so you have to add both by the ABC and the TTB. I think the designation is when I add yeast, it counts as beer. Prior to that, it's like an unregulated product. So regulation-wise, that's easier. Functionality-wise, it's easier too. We're brewing into a stainless steel tote. We're bringing that back. We're adding yeast on site. That counts as fermentation. Then it becomes an alcoholic product. And then we do, fermentation, packaging, blending, fruiting. All these things are at Mieza.
It sounds like the whole process is very artisanal, right? In the sense that it's very conceptual. I have an idea, I have a hypothesis. What would happen if we did it like this? And then you're tasting along the way to see what happened actually. But it's very high concept to begin with.
Yeah. Well, there aren't that many established parameters of like, what's my dissolved oxygen? Well, I guess these things are measurable. It could be just as measurable, but no, I'm hesitant. Every brewery slide is like it's the science and the art and the culture, and like I think that's all true as a lay place, but like there's a lot of people that talk about is wine art and they say no, and it's so I was trying to dive in a couple aesthetics books and it wasn't going well. My undergrad was like in mainly bioethics, but it was like a philosophy major, and like none of this stuff was helpful. And like, aesthetics might be more important than ethics in our current world. Is a weird twerk, but So whether it's science or art is a more complicated. I think some of the old guys would essentially say like, in art you can depict a sailboat. Like we see the sailboat, or like there's a score, but then modern art doesn't fall into that category. Like it's splotches. So like is wine or beer splotches against the wall that make us feel something. I don't have a good opinion on that, but it should be talked about more. But it is more artistic, whatever that means. So.
Is there anything over the years, components or things that you've tried that you've gone back to and it just doesn't work? Like this and this do not go together?
The thing that's failed a bunch is I always wanted like 100% Brett fermentations, and I kept getting THP, which could have been easily like, well, you just underpitched, like we should have done lager. So THP is the Cheerio flavor after breath. In natural wine, it's like mouse taint and actually smells like mice in the attic. It never shows itself in beer that well, or that extreme. But it's a weird thing of like, you sip the beer, it's fully down your throat. And whether it's like an enzymes that are creating it, it's like you get this like taco shells Cheerio effect. And it's like, it's not a bad flavor, but it's super off-putting once you, I have one beer that has it not in the bottle on tap, and I've done it like, tasting room prefers it like 60% to 40. But again, on that compositional level, it's like the thing on tap with the Cheerio, it's like far more perfumey, and like the bottle is like so much more zippy. So I want to like but I pulled off, like I had one keg of something that is now 8 years old. And it was like I think it was a Mosaic dry hop session IPA with 100% Brett ferment, and it's been sitting warm for 8 years, super juicy, like absolute, yeah, like this is young hazy IPA, level aromatics, sitting warm for 8 years. So that's a magical side of Brett, but the other aspects of doing a Brett session beer, and again, that's one base brew, that's one $800 yeast pitch. Otherwise, I'm doing it like, oh, here's like, you know, I'm trying to continue all these saisons. So it's like, this one yeast brink will go in for free. So that's something that deserves attention that I haven't done well. Yeah. And the spontaneous stuff is a 1 on the binary. Like, it's tasting great. It's not, I think I'm at year 2, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of that lambic funk. And I don't know where to take that separate. Like, I'm probably just going to do the same thing. There's not a recipe or process difference, but it's not achieving that funk. But it is a very good beer. So those are the 2 areas that have not worked out. Oh, and then raspberries are too acidic, and I keep on not applying. And then, so I keep applying not overly acidic bases, but it's not making up for. So I'm throwing like malolactic bacteria that is made for wine just in there, and that kind of works. So like converting, but I seem to hate raspberries. Like I'll go to the Sovereign, like order 7 raspberry bottles, and they're all too acidic for me. And then another failure has been just blonde bases with grapes. In California, like the beer would show itself. There'd be a lactic component. Might be a hop. And for whatever reason, I haven't had the blending stock to really differ. So on the tasting room, it's great where it's like, oh, do you drink red wine? They say yes. And like, try this, and it's just like, it's very grape-forward expression. But for whatever reason, for like 3 years now, I've failed to do what I did. Is like, at Bear Republic, I would buy the beer, inoculate it, then put it on grape. So it was cheaper for me, as opposed to homebrewing, to get an employee discount on like a Maibach and sour that. It was so awesome. And my landlord thought I was like making meth. But another neighbor, like super nice, was selling heroin, and no one knew until they got robbed. But like, and then when I was moving out of the place, there was like Mormon missionaries, right? I could walk to work, but there's Mormon missionaries like across the street, and so they saw me like loading my car, and they're like, "Oh, can we help?" And like they have the suits on. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. So I'd park at their place because I only have like, it was a converted motel with like a parking spot as like the patio. So I would like bring stuff over, and they got spooked because they thought it was like drug pair. It was like all homebrewing equipment. But I was bringing back some of these like sour concepts like in keg. Because like, I'm not going to give it to anyone here. And like, I thought it was precious at the time or whatever. So yeah, before I'm leaving, like I had a buddy driving across the country with me, but they're like, and one of the 4 cops of like Cloverdale was Mormon. So he was like super like, what's going on? They're like, we're so sorry when we called, like, we're so scared. And like, you could have just talked to me. It's like, this is homebrew equipment. But they had like a domestic violence call And so like they like scooted off, but the guy said like, you just got to leave now. So I never cleaned my apartment. I like just like got out of Dodge in Cloverdale with all this like ex-homebrew stuff in a mobile trailer, or like in a hatch trailer, which I thought was kind of funny. It's like I like never back.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry guys.